During a secret Soviet mission in the Arctic, divers encountered something terrifying. The reports were classified and buried for decades. When fragments finally surfaced, even experts were disturbed. Some say it was never meant to be found. Join us as we uncover the horror hidden beneath the Arctic ice.
Number 12. USS Scorpion SSN 589 Atlantic sinking 1968. May 22, 1968. Somewhere in the Atlantic, 400 miles southwest of the Azores, the USS Scorpion stopped responding to radio calls. All 99 sailors on board vanished without a trace. The Navy declared it overdue 5 days later, on May 27, but people inside the radio room at Submarine Command already knew something was catastrophically wrong within hours of the disaster. Radio men on duty said officers were openly discussing an explosion detected by underwater listening arrays. The Scorpion was a skipjack-class nuclear attack submarine, fast, quiet, and deadly, at least on paper. In reality, by 1968, it was falling apart. The crew called it USS Scrap Iron because of constant mechanical breakdowns. The sub had been scheduled for a major overhaul, but the Navy cut it short to get Scorpion back to sea faster. On May 21, the sub sent its last message while near the Azores. Then, silence. The Navy launched a massive search using hydroacoustic data from secret underwater listening stations. They pinpointed 2 explosions, one small, followed seconds later by a much larger blast. 5 months later, on October 30, 1968, a deep-sea camera found the wreckage sitting in 11,000 feet of water. The submarine had been ripped nearly in half. Theories about what happened range from a malfunctioning torpedo that detonated inside the sub to a Soviet retaliatory strike for the earlier sinking of K-129. The official Navy Court of Inquiry called the cause inconclusive. Declassified documents later revealed that a defective battery in a Mark 37 torpedo had exploded during tests weeks before Scorpion sank, and the Navy never pulled those batteries from active subs. Families of the dead pushed for decades to reopen the investigation. In 2012, the U.S. Submarine Veterans Organization formally requested it. The Navy denied the request. The Scorpion still sits on the ocean floor today, along with 2 nuclear-tipped torpedoes and a fully loaded reactor, all of it quietly corroding in the cold Atlantic dark. Number 11. Russian Kursk K-141 Barents Sea explosion 2000. August 12, 2000. The Russian nuclear submarine Kursk was participating in a major naval exercise in the Barents Sea, the first large-scale war games Russia had conducted in over a decade. At 11:28 a.m. local time, an explosion ripped through the forward torpedo compartment. 2 minutes later, a second, much larger blast tore the submarine apart. Norwegian seismic stations recorded the second explosion as equivalent to 5 tons of TNT detonating underwater. The battlecruiser Pyotr Veliki, operating nearby, reportedly shook from the force. The Kursk, one of Russia's largest and most advanced attack submarines, sank in 354 feet of water at a steep angle. The bow was nearly torn off. Most of the 118 crew members died instantly, but not all of them. In a sealed rear compartment, 23 sailors survived the initial blasts. Lieutenant Captain Dmitry Koselnikov, one of the officers trapped inside, left a handwritten note time-stamped 2 hours after the explosion. The note listed the names of 23 survivors waiting for rescue in near-total darkness, as water slowly filled the compartment. They had maybe 6 hours of breathable air. The Russian Navy didn't start rescue efforts for 6 hours after the disaster. It took another 5 hours before the sinking was declared an emergency. By then, 11 hours had passed, and it would be another 16 hours before anyone even located the sunken submarine. President Vladimir Putin, who was on vacation at the time, refused international help for 5 days. When British and Norwegian dive teams finally arrived on August 18th, 6 days after the disaster, it was far too late. Norwegian divers opened the hatch on August 21. Everyone inside was dead. The investigation concluded that a hydrogen peroxide leak from a faulty Type 65 torpedo caused the first explosion, which then detonated the torpedo's 900-pound warhead. The second blast was the remaining torpedoes in the compartment exploding in a chain reaction. The Russian government was criticized globally for the delayed response, outdated rescue equipment, and initial attempts to blame NATO for the disaster. The submarine was eventually raised from the seafloor in 2001, minus the bow, which was too damaged and remains on the ocean floor. I'm going to ask you a simple question. Are you a naturally curious person? If you're watching, I'm pretty sure the answer is yes. This space is made for people like us. To ensure you're always part of this community and receive all our latest discoveries, you just need to do one thing: subscribe to the channel. It's the best way to stay connected with us. Okay, now that you're part of our Legion of the Curious, let's move on to the next item.
Number 10. Operation Cold Feet, CIA Arctic Raid, 1962. On May 28, 1962, two Americans parachuted out of a B-17 bomber and landed on a chunk of ice in the middle of the Arctic Ocean. Their target, an abandoned Soviet research station called NP-8. The mission had a code name, Operation Cold Feet, and it was run by the CIA. Here's why it mattered. The US suspected the Soviets were using their floating ice stations to track American submarines passing through Arctic waters. The Navy wanted proof. NP-8 had been abandoned weeks earlier when its ice started breaking apart. The Soviets left in a hurry, and they left almost everything behind. Food was still sitting on the stove, frozen in pans. The two operatives, Air Force Major James Smith and Navy Reserve Lieutenant Leonard Leshak, spent 6 days on that crumbling ice platform. They went through piles of documents, grabbed equipment, and took over 100 photographs. When it was time to leave, they couldn't land a plane. Instead, they used something called the Fulton Skyhook, a system where a plane flies over, hooks a cable attached to the person on the ground, and literally reels them into the sky at 150 miles per hour. Both men got pulled out. The intelligence they brought back confirmed it. The Soviets were actively tracking US submarines under the Arctic ice, and they were developing new techniques to do it better. The intelligence they pulled from that station reshaped how the US Navy planned its Arctic submarine routes for years after. The Soviets didn't find out their station had been raided until long after the damage was done.
Number 9. Ivy Bell's Operation, USS Halibut, Cable Tapping. December 1970. A modified submarine called USS Halibut sits in pitch-black water somewhere in the Sea of Okhotsk. The water is freezing. Visibility is 0. And right now, Soviet divers, or rather American divers operating from the sub, are crawling along the ocean floor, searching for a communications cable that runs from a major Soviet submarine base on the Kamchatka Peninsula all the way to fleet headquarters near Vladivostok. They found it. Using special suits that pumped warm water against their bodies to fight the cold, the divers attached a 20-foot-long listening device directly onto the cable without cutting into it. The bug recorded every single communication that passed through. Once a month, Navy divers went back down and swapped out the tapes. Those recordings went straight to the National Security Agency. Here's the part that made it even more effective. The Soviets weren't encrypting most of the traffic on that cable. They simply didn't believe anyone could tap it. The operation, codenamed Ivy Bells, ran for years. USS Halibut earned 2 presidential unit citations for repeated missions. The whole thing only fell apart in 1981 when an NSA employee named Ronald Pelton sold the secret to Moscow for $35,000. The original listening device is now reportedly on display at the KGB Museum in Moscow. The whole operation proved one thing beyond any doubt. The ocean floor during the Cold War was not empty. It was a battlefield, silent, invisible, and packed with secrets that governments on both sides fought to keep buried.
Number 8. Soviet Mir submersibles North Pole dive. The year was 2007, and 2 Russian submersibles just made history. The Mir 1 and Mir 2, both built in the mid-1980s, descended over 14,000 feet to the actual floor of the Arctic Ocean, directly beneath the North Pole. Nobody had ever done it before. Chief scientist Artur Chilingarov planted a titanium flag on the seafloor to mark the moment. The Russian government awarded him Hero of the Russian Federation for it. But here's what most people missed about that dive. The Mir submersibles weren't just built for show missions. Throughout their operational life, these 2 vehicles carried out classified Soviet and later Russian military operations deep underwater. Open records from the Soviet era describe them as being used for fisheries research, but Western analysts noted that civilian fisheries programs never used manned submersibles. The real missions stayed hidden. These were steel capsules barely bigger than the people inside them, basic life support, limited communication, crushing pressure at depth. Every dive was a calculated risk. The technology that powered them was decades in the making, developed partly by Finnish shipbuilders because Soviet shipyards were fully occupied building warships.
The $50 million contract was signed in the mid-1980s. By 1987, both vehicles were in the water. They became Russia's most capable deep-sea assets, and the stories of what they found on those classified dives remain largely untold.
Number 7. Soviet Typhoon-class ballistic missile submarines. In 1981, the Soviet Union launched the largest submarine ever built, the Typhoon-class ballistic missile submarine. At 574 feet long and displacing 48,000 tons when submerged, the Typhoon dwarfed every other submarine on the planet. For comparison, American Ohio-class subs are about 560 feet long and displace 18,000 tons. The Typhoon was more than twice as heavy. The Typhoon wasn't just big, it was designed to operate under the Arctic ice cap for months at a time. The hull was built with 2 separate pressure chambers side by side, making it nearly unsinkable. The conning tower was reinforced to break through ice over 6 feet thick, and the submarine carried 20 R-39 ballistic missiles, each tipped with up to 10 nuclear warheads. A single Typhoon could deliver 200 independently targeted nuclear strikes, enough firepower to destroy an entire continent. 6 Typhoons were built between 1981 and 1989. They patrolled the Arctic Ocean, staying hidden under the ice where American satellites and sonar couldn't find them. The strategy was simple. If the United States launched a nuclear-first strike, the Typhoons would surface through the ice and retaliate. The Soviets called them city killers. NATO called them the Akula class, Russian for shark. Western intelligence agencies were terrified of them. Inside, the Typhoons were surprisingly comfortable. They had saunas, a swimming pool, and a gym. The crew quarters were more spacious than any other submarine in the world. Some sailors spent 6 months straight underwater without ever surfacing. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Russia couldn't afford to maintain the fleet. Most of the Typhoons were decommissioned and scrapped. Only one remains in active service today, the Dmitry Donskoy, and it's used primarily for testing new missile systems. The rest sit in decommissioning facilities, slowly being dismantled. But for nearly 2 decades, the Typhoon-class submarines represented the ultimate expression of Cold War submarine technology, massive, silent, and capable of ending the world. Number 6. Soviet K-19 Submarine Reactor Meltdown, 1961. July 4, 1961. The Soviet submarine K-19 was running drills in the North Atlantic off the coast of Greenland when the pressure in the starboard nuclear reactor dropped to 0. A pipe had ruptured, coolant was pouring out, and there was no backup system because Soviet shipbuilders had rushed construction and skipped installing one. The reactor started heating up fast. If it hit full meltdown, the explosion could trigger the nuclear warheads on board and potentially start World War III. Captain Nikolai Zateyev had one option: send his engineers into the reactor compartment to build a makeshift cooling system by hand. The problem? The compartment was flooded with lethal radiation, over 1,000 Roentgens per hour. The men who went in wore nothing but raincoats and gas masks. There were no radiation suits. They worked in shifts, each lasting only a few minutes because any longer meant certain death. Using welding torches and spare piping, the crew jerry-rigged a new coolant loop using the ship's drinking water supply. It worked. The reactor cooled down. The submarine didn't explode. But the cost was brutal. All 7 engineers who entered the reactor room died within 3 weeks from acute radiation sickness. Another 15 crew members died over the next 2 years. In total, 22 men from the original 139-man crew were killed by radiation exposure. The Soviet government buried the dead in lead-lined coffins and swore the survivors to secrecy. Families were told their loved ones died in the line of duty, nothing more. The truth didn't come out until 1991, 3 decades later, when the Russian newspaper Pravda finally published the story. Sailors who had survived were still getting sick and dying from radiation-related cancers well into the 2000s. In 2006, former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev nominated the K-19 crew for a Nobel Peace Prize, calling their actions heroic. The submarine itself earned a different nickname among Soviet sailors: Hiroshima.
Number 5. Yablokov Commission Soviet Nuclear Dumping Report. In 1993, a Russian government commission released a report that shocked the international community. Named after its chairman, Alexei Yablokov, the report confirmed what environmental groups had suspected for decades. The Soviet Union had been secretly dumping nuclear waste into Arctic waters on a massive scale, and had been lying about it the entire time. The numbers in the report were staggering. 2 submarines with active reactors, 14 nuclear reactors total, 5 of them still loaded with spent fuel. 19 ships sunk with radioactive material inside, over 17,000 containers of waste, and 735 pieces of contaminated heavy machinery. The Soviet Navy had been doing this since 1960, continuing right up until the early 1990s. Moscow had denied everything for years, even after the London Dumping Convention, which the Soviet Union had signed, restricted ocean dumping of radioactive material. The IAEA later confirmed that Soviet dumping alone exceeded the combined total of every other nuclear nation on Earth. The Yablokov report forced Russia to open its records and cooperate with Norwegian-led international expeditions to map the contamination. Today, scientists are still working on how to clean it up, or at the very least, contain it before warming Arctic waters destabilize decades of buried radioactive waste sitting on the seafloor. The Yablokov report didn't just expose the past, it cracked open a problem that no single country can fix alone, and one that the Arctic and the rest of the world is still dealing with.
Number 4. Project Azorian, CIA K-129 submarine recovery. The authorities thought they had seen everything, until the CIA pulled off one of the most audacious covert operations in history. In March 1968, a Soviet submarine called K-129 suffered a catastrophic failure and sank to the ocean floor, nearly 3 miles deep in the Pacific northwest of Hawaii. All 98 crew members died. The Soviets launched a massive search, but gave up after 2 months. They had no idea the Americans had already pinpointed the wreck using underwater listening stations. What followed was a 6-year, $800 million operation called Project Azorian. The CIA secretly built a custom ship, the Hughes Glomar Explorer, designed to look like a deep-sea mining vessel. For months, it sat above the wreck site while Soviet Navy ships watched nearby, completely unaware of the real mission happening below them. The ship lowered a giant mechanical claw nearly 3 miles down, grabbed the submarine, and started pulling it up. Partway through the lift, the sub broke apart. A section containing the remains of 6 Soviet sailors was successfully recovered. Those remains were given a formal military burial at sea, a moment that was filmed by the CIA and later handed over to Russia in 1992. The operation cost more in today's dollars than $5 billion. The CIA called it one of the greatest intelligence coups of the Cold War. And even now, the full list of what was recovered from that submarine remains classified.
Number 3. Soviet Northern Fleet Submarine Base, Polyarny. 30 miles from the Norwegian border sits Polyarny, a closed military city that has been the primary home of Russia's Northern Fleet submarine force since 1899. During the Cold War, this remote Arctic port became the busiest submarine base on the planet. At its peak in the 1980s, Polyarny housed over 200 submarines, both diesel-electric and nuclear-powered, docked in reinforced pens carved directly into the granite cliffs. The base was invisible from the air and nearly impossible to attack. Soviet engineers tunneled deep into the mountains, creating a network of underground repair facilities, weapons storage bunkers, and living quarters for submariners. Some of the tunnels extended over 2 miles into solid rock. Submarines could enter through narrow channels, disappear into the mountain, and resurface weeks later, fully armed and ready for patrol. The entire operation was designed to survive a nuclear first strike. American spy satellites tracked the base constantly, but could never get a full picture of what was happening inside those tunnels. During the 1970s and 1980s, NATO estimated that up to 70% of the Soviet Union's ballistic missile submarines operated out of Polyarny and nearby Gajiezo. That made this single stretch of Arctic coastline one of the most dangerous places on Earth, home to enough firepower to end human civilization several times over. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the Russian Navy couldn't afford to maintain most of its fleet. Hundreds of submarines were left to rust at anchor. Many of them still had nuclear fuel on board.
By the mid-1990s, environmental groups raised alarms about radiation leaks from decaying reactors. International cleanup efforts began in the early 2000s, funded partly by Norway and the United States. Crews removed spent fuel rods, dismantled reactors, and tried to contain contamination. The work is still ongoing. Polyarny remains operational today as the headquarters of Russia's Northern Fleet. The exact number of active submarines stationed there is classified, but satellite imagery from 2023 shows at least 20 nuclear-powered vessels docked at the base, including several of Russia's newest Bore-class ballistic missile submarines.
Number 2. SOSS, Sound Surveillance System Atlantic Network. During the Cold War, the U.S. Navy built a secret underwater listening network so sensitive it could detect a Soviet submarine starting its engines from over 1,000 miles away. It was called SOSS, the Sound Surveillance System, and it changed naval warfare forever. SOSS consisted of chains of underwater microphones, called hydrophones, placed along the ocean floor at strategic choke points across the Atlantic and Pacific. The arrays were positioned in deep water channels, where sound waves traveled efficiently over vast distances, a phenomenon called the SOFAR channel. Each array contained dozens of hydrophones, wired together and connected by underwater cables to shore-based processing stations. The system went operational in the 1950s and remained one of the most closely guarded military secrets for decades. SOSS allowed the Navy to track every Soviet submarine that left port. Analysts could identify individual vessels by the unique acoustic signature of their propellers and machinery. They could tell if a sub was running on battery power or nuclear propulsion. They could detect torpedo launches, reactor startups, and even mechanical failures happening inside the hull. When the USS Scorpion sank in 1968, SOSS recorded the entire disaster in real time. The initial explosion, followed 91 seconds later by the sound of the submarine's compartments imploding one by one as it descended past crush depth. That data was used to pinpoint the wreck's location months later. SOSS also tracked the Soviet submarine K-129 when it sank in 1968. Analysts heard the explosion and calculated the exact coordinates, which the CIA later used for Project Azorian. The Soviets knew SOSS existed, but never fully figured out how it worked or where all the arrays were located. They spent billions trying to develop quieter submarines to evade detection. By the 1980s, Soviet subs were coating their hulls in sound-absorbing materials and using special propellers designed to minimize noise. Some of the original SOSS arrays are still operational today, now used for tracking marine life and monitoring underwater volcanic activity. But during the Cold War, this hidden web of microphones gave the U.S. an unbeatable advantage in the silent war beneath the waves.
Number 1. Camp Century, Project Iceworm, Greenland. Just when you thought it couldn't get stranger, consider this. In 1959, the U.S. Army built an entire city under the ice in Greenland. They called it Camp Century. 21 tunnels, stretching nearly 2 miles total, carved right into the glacier. It had a hospital, a theater, a church, and a shop. A small nuclear reactor powered the whole thing. Up to 200 soldiers lived there. The public version of the story was simple. It was a research outpost designed to test Arctic construction. But documents that stayed classified until 1996 revealed the real purpose. Camp Century was the test site for Project Iceworm, a plan to hide 600 nuclear missiles underneath the Greenland ice sheet. The tunnels would have extended 2,500 miles, 60 launch centers, 11,000 troops, all hidden from the Soviets beneath a mile of ice. The plan fell apart within 3 years. Glaciologists working at the site discovered that the ice was moving far faster than anyone predicted. Tunnels started collapsing on their own. Ceilings dropped. The Army tried to keep up by having soldiers carve back the encroaching ice with chainsaws, but it was a losing fight. Camp Century was abandoned in 1967. In April 2024, NASA accidentally rediscovered it during a radar flyover, buried about 100 feet below the surface, completely swallowed by the ice. The waste it left behind, including radioactive material, is still sitting down there, waiting.
Still curious? Then don't stop now. The next mystery is already waiting for you.
Just click the video on screen. I saved it just for you. See you there, curious one.